Hi, everybody. I'm here with a very famous, becoming more famous Egyptologist named Dr. David Falk, and he's coming from Canada. And he and I today are going to talk about his excellent book, The Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian Context. And so we're going to talk about that. This is a fantastic book. If you haven't had a chance to go out and read it, go out and read it, get it, definitely do that. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the issues surrounding whether the Exodus happened, the documentary hypothesis, we might make a couple of mentions of that, and whether Moses, the much of the Pentateuch should be attributed to Moses and written during the Egyptian time period, if there's any evidence in the Bible that it should be written during the Egyptian time period. And then, of course, how the Ark of the Covenant itself came about, and how it originally was the Ark of the Testimony, which I didn't realize. And so there's a lot of really interesting pieces of information that I learned about in his book. And so without further ado, let me introduce Dr. David Falk with his, by the way, he has 3 master's degrees and a Ph.D. So this person is not short of knowledge. So Dr. Falk, can you let us know a little bit about yourself?
I think you covered it pretty well there. I do have 3 master's degrees, one in Egyptology, one in biblical archaeology, and I've got a Master of Divinity. My PhD is in Egyptology from the University of Liverpool, and I run a little YouTube channel. That's me in a nutshell.
And your YouTube channel has been making a big splash lately. So you said you told me a little while ago you started up right in the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020, and he already has over 4,000, maybe 4,500 subscribers. So go over there. The first thing you should do after you watch this video is to go over and subscribe to his channel. Be sure you're subscribed and be sure to follow him because he makes very interesting popcorn. I mean, besides your regular educational videos, you do these popcorn videos that are I mean, I have to say
that was a complete accident. We weren't intending to do that sort of thing, but it was just one of those happy accidents where, you know, we did it and it just turned out to be so popular that we just sort of kept doing it. The whole popcorn shtick was a matter of convenience more than anything, which was, you know, I'd been working that day, had to come home, respond to a video, and was hungry and decided to film and eat some popcorn at the same time.
Yeah, and you did. And I have to say, I have my inner bulldog kind of really appreciates those videos because you go in there and you'll find an opinion that people are circulating that's usually a flopsy opinion, and you go in there and dissect it with all kinds of factual information so that people can feel comfortable that we can believe what we believe in with respect to the Bible.
Well, we do it as a teaching exercise. That's why we continue doing it. Yes, we understand that there's an entertainment aspect as well. But really, we do it as a way to teach. And we think that teaching should be pleasurable, that it should be entertaining. You know, your first job as a teacher is to keep the student awake. So if you're doing things so boring that people are falling asleep, you're not that good of a teacher. So, you know, you do have to make it enjoyable as well.
Yeah, it's very true. It's very true. So let me ask you a few questions from the book. And so I've got the book marked off. When I was reading it, I kept thinking, I hope I can get Dr. Falk on my channel so that I can ask questions about this book. So I started doing my stickies. And then today I went back and reviewed my stickies. And so the very first question is there are people who think that the Exodus took place in the 15th century or I think 15th century BC, but you have some pretty good evidence, and also that some people might not realize that you've pointed out that this is the traditional view that it actually took place in the 13th century BC. And so the people who think it took place in the earlier times go with the number 480 that was given in there, 480 years as a literal number. And so what would you say to them? How do we tell them that, hey, there's some other ways to look at this?
Well, I mean, we do have to recognize that original, that 480 view was first espoused by James Orr in 1906. So it is a very recent view. And it's a recent view that came about as a result of being able to date Solomon's temple. And basically they use the date of Solomon's temple and then backdate that 480 years to get the 15th century date. Now, James Orr was a very, very conservative Scottish scholar who basically basically fought against the liberalism of his day, the progressive, more scholarship of his day. So he basically earned a lot of respect when he did his book countering that scholarship. But one of the aspects that was sort of thrown into this book as a new theory, brand new theory, and he admits it's a brand new theory. So he's not claiming it as an old theory. And as a Scottish theologian, well trained, he would know the history of this. Mm-hmm. That this is how you date, say, the Exodus. And basically, because his book had so much traction in, say, more American fundamentalist circles, it was then sort of picked up and so adopted as the date. That combined with, say, the Schofield Bible that was in circulation at the time that had published Ussher's chronology, which had a date that was similar but arrived at through different means. Ussher takes a completely different approach, but that sort of confirmed this notion of a 15th century date.
Yeah. Yes. And then you were able to look at the sort of symbolism of the 12 and the 40 and how that could get put together.
Yeah, it's when we look at, say, 1 Kings 6:1, we have to recognize that this is a temple dedication inscription. We have numerous examples of this from across the ancient Near East. We have for example, the dedication of Tukulti-Ninurta the first, which takes 60, which is the Mesopotamian equivalent of 40, in that it means an extended long period of time. It was the basis of their sexagesimal mathematics system, which was base 60. And then they multiplied that by 12 to get 720 years to the dedication of the Temple of Ishtar. So we find that in Mesopotamian dedication inscriptions. We also find this sort of numerology in, say, Egyptian temple dedication inscriptions as well, such as with the Temple of Seth at Avaris, where a 400th year, 4th month, 4th day is to a Hyksos king is being recorded, when we know that there were no Hyksos kings that far back. So there's an aspect to this, these dedication inscriptions, and they all follow the same sort of pattern, which is really interesting. You see these patterns in these temple dedication inscriptions where there is first of all, there's a temple being dedicated or rededicated. It then harkens back to an important historical event, and the years harking back to that are of, say numerological, but not necessarily accurate description. In fact, we don't find a single one of these that's accurate, which is really amazing just on its own. That's
fascinating. So yeah, I think that's good, and I think that also speaks to, like, a lot of times in the Bible, I was noticing that sometimes there is the references to 7 and 40 and 12 as sort of fullness, and so that just makes a lot of sense.
Well, 40 is it's an idiom. It's an idiom. It's an idiomatic expression. It means an extended, indeterminate, long period, or a large number. So it carries with it the notion of, say, fullness but indeterminacy. This is why you see in the prophecy of Ezekiel where Egypt is supposed to be desolate for 40 years. And we see 40 used all through the scriptures. We
do.
Where it says that say Jesus Christ fasted 40, did not eat or drink for 40 days and 40 nights. Well, if he's fully man, then he had to have drank before the end of the 40 days, because that's lethal in a human.
Yeah. Yeah, so that gets us to the question that sort of directly brings us. I'm looking right here, and I can mention in your book, just so everybody knows, if you guys haven't gotten it, it's not just a book of words, it's a book of pictures and words. And so you have a lot of pictures you've taken yourself. And so there are all kinds of images of ancient Egyptian pottery and just all kinds of even what the Ark of the Covenant would have looked like, and a lot of scenes that you took yourself of just beautiful scenes that take place.
I blew my entire advance on a trip to Egypt to take photographs.
And they're nice. And so on this page that I'm looking at right here, it says you have a map of Egypt and Sinai, and you've got this little trail that Moses would have taken. And you say something that's kind of interesting. You say, why did they take the long route to get to Canaan? And of course, the other thing is, and did it really take 40 years, or is that just sort of an idiom, like a fullness expression? Because this goes to what Dr. Joel Baden said on the Myth Vision channel. He said something like, well, in one part of the Bible, it implies that Moses didn't go 40 years. In another part, it says he did. There's multiple authors in the Bible. We support the documentary hypothesis that all of these people stepped in and contributed to the book. Yeah. But anyway, so going back to this 40-year and this route, you've actually mapped out this route in the book. What do you think? Why did they take this longer route? Why wouldn't they be efficient with their route?
Well, I mean, there's two reasons. There are two main roads going from Canaan to Egypt. You had the one that followed the north coast adjacent to the Mediterranean, which was called the Road of Horus. In the Bible, it's called the way to the land of the Philistines. Okay, that's the same road. But essentially, this was a road that was fortified. So it was completely peppered with fortresses. It was a highly garrisoned, highly manned defensive road. And it was to keep people from coming in and out of Egypt. It was essentially to throttle that traffic. So we're told in the Bible that they didn't take that route because they would have had to fight all the way to Canaan. They would have known nothing but war all the way through. So that's why they didn't take that path. The other path that's very common is called the way of Shur. And it's referenced in say the book of Genesis, when that's the path that Hagar tries to take returning to Egypt. And it was a path that was often taken by caravans. Now, the problem with the way of Shur is there's no wells. There's no water. If you didn't, caravans would stock up with 7 or 8 days of water before taking that path, because it was a death sentence if you didn't have the water.
Yeah, would be.
So that's obviously not going to be ideal for the children of Israel to try to make their way over. Now, so what they do is they cut down the west coast of the Sinai Peninsula, essentially hopping from oasis to oasis. And then they cut over through the Wadi Faran to Mount Sinai, where they stay there for a while to essentially get their religious affairs in order. They stay there for roughly a year to build the tabernacle, to build the Ark of the Covenant, to finish the treaty with God, to stamp out that covenant and cut the treaty. And then they go up to Kadesh Barnea. And that's usually within about the span of roughly a year. As at that point, they have that moral failing of the 12 spies that they sent into Canaan to check out the land. And it's at that point they then wander for 40 years.
Oh, that's interesting. And so would you agree? Now there are 3 videos that I watched that I wanted to sort of get a couple of comments from you on, but one of them also, that one was these are all on, 2 of them are on Myth Vision's channel. The other one I found on Kipp Davis's channel. But one of the things that Dr. Josh Bowen said on the Myth Vision channel was he was talking about, and actually also Baden talks about the kernels of truth, how there's just these little kernels of truth in the Bible with respect to the Exodus, and that the Exodus didn't happen the way that we think it happened. But one thing that Dr. Bowen added in there is he said that he was talking about this what was it called here? The Anastasia papyrus that talked about these. Yeah, Anastasia papyrus.
Anastasia, yeah.
Say it again.
Anastasia.
Anastasia. Okay. I'm terrible with pronunciation. He was talking about this papyrus that talked about these two slaves. And he said because the Egyptians had all these fortifications, that it's unlikely that this large group of Israelites would be able to escape given all of these fortifications. And that seems to maybe relate to your last answer to the last question.
Well, it does, definitely. Because one of the route that the Israelites take is actually not well fortified. It's not well fortified. There was a Ketem fortress, which is a sort of a entry checkpoint. It's a major fortress, but that's at Pithom. So once they get past, they're not going out the northern route, because when the Israelites leave Egypt, they're actually on the south bank of the Plusiac. They're not crossing the river to take a direct northern route. They could have. They could have taken crossed the river and taken a road north through, say, the Fortress Charu, and then the Lion's Den, and then Migdol. Okay, they could have taken that route, but that would have been possibly a fight all the way through. But they're already on the southern bank, so it doesn't actually make sense for them to cross the river. They go south and cross through the Wadi Tumilat, where there's only one fortress. There's only one fortress there, and that's at the provincial capital of Pithom or Peratum, the house of Atum. Once they cross that, there's no more fortresses unless they decide to go back up through the northern route. What you do have there, though, you do have some looking posts. You do have some outposts there. There are a bunch of little towns out there on basically the southern side of the Plusiac estuary. So you'll, like, Pihahirot is probably a looking post, an observation post. But it is not, say, a fully garrisoned Ketem fortress. So as long as they avoided that northern road, there's no fortresses to hunt them down. But it's their wandering there in that desert between, in that wilderness between Pihahirot, Bel Safon, and Migdol that does attract the Egyptians' attention to draw out the chariots after them.
That is interesting and consistent with the narrative.
Consistent with the narrative.
Yeah,
it's
very good.
Geographically consistent.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And in the papyrus, in the Anastasia papyri, and those are many papyri. It's not just one. There's many of those papyri. We find the names of this geography that we find in the biblical texts. Baal Zephon is mentioned. Pihahirot is mentioned. Migdol is mentioned. Pithom is mentioned. Paramses is mentioned. These are all, even the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, is mentioned. All of these are real, actual place names that we find in both the biblical and the Egyptian records.
Yeah. Great. That's great. That gives people a lot of peace when they realize that there is consistency there. That also speaks to one other thing. So I know in your book you talk about Ramses II being the pharaoh who was in the office at the time, and I'm just wondering about going into this idea of Ramses II, and also Avaris. You talk about the people coming from there. I wanted to know if you could share a little bit about if we have any sort of archaeological evidence in support of this time period, because I also heard Dr. Josh Bowen saying that we don't. So I'm wondering if we do. He said that we have evidence around 1,000, but we don't have. So
no. Yeah. Essentially, the city of Avaris was the largest Semitic city, west of the Orontes. Okay, at the time. Which is in the late Bronze Age. It was the largest Semitic cities west of the Orontes. The numbers for the population there vary between, say, 10 and, say, 200,000. So we're not exactly sure exactly how big it was, but we know it was big. The site covers 250 hectares. It had constant Semitic occupation from Dynasty 11 until the reign of Ramses II, in which most of the city was abandoned at that point. The only thing that wasn't abandoned was the port. The port was still in service up until Dynasty 20. But we know, for example, from the Temple of Baal district, that it had constant Semitic occupation. And during mid-Dynasty 19, which also happens to be during the reign of Ramses II because he lived so long, we find that it's then converted from, say, residential area to essentially a cemetery. So essentially, people are taking those old houses and just started burying their dead in there as tombs. But we find all sorts of evidence of Semitic occupation there. We find Semitic pottery, Semitic worship, Semitic funerary assemblages. So it's a Semitic city, and it had been a Semitic city since Dynasty 11. And part of it is because of at the end of the Neolithic wet period, the tribes of, say, Semites and Libyans who were making their subsistence living hunting. Basically, the weather started drying out, the food sources started going away, and they had to migrate into the Nile Delta for survival. And this is where sort of the Joseph narrative picks up, is during that time of famine when they have to sort of pick up and move there too to, keep eating.
Yeah, because Joseph stored up all the food.
Yeah,
he had the
and
dream.
Joseph arrives at the beginning of Dynasty 15. Okay. So at about the time when we see the beginning of the Hyksos ascendancy.
One of the things you have in your book too that's very fascinating. Now, there's a bunch of things that are fascinating, but just the treatment of these gods, these statues that the Egyptians have. And I don't remember if I heard this from you or where I heard this, but there was also this idea that if you say you raid another town and you plunder them and you basically take the town away, people would take the gods out of the temple and run with the gods over to their new city or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, that
would really terrorize these people when their gods were taken out of their temples. And so then you even talked about
we don't find that so much in Egypt. We don't find that so much in Egypt. That's definitely true in, say, Mesopotamia, when the Hittites invade Babylon. They take Marduk and take it back to Hatti with them.
And that terrorized him. I mean, it would do it. You just took our God. And then even the treatment of the gods. So you said that they treat them almost like they're little infants, like they take care of the gods.
Oh, yeah, they clothe them, feed them, put them to bed at night, wake them up in the morning, clothe them again.
Yeah, it's very, very strange. So that reminds. So what I also was thinking about is the Ark of the Covenant. Now that is supposed to be the Ark, and it was the Ark of the Testimony, you said, and then it was the Ark of the Covenant. And can you speak to that, and also how it was consistent with the way that the Egyptians were building these little encasements at that time?
Well, what we have in the case of the Ark of the Covenant is essentially it's a kind of both a shrine and a reliquary, basically something to hold holy objects. So it was both, and both in one. Now, we do find these things consistent with what we find it constructed in Egyptian furniture. So now, everything from, say, the mercy seat, where you have the two goddesses facing each other, and in the center, between the wings of these goddesses, would reside the god. Usually, it's statue. Mm-hmm. Now, the design patterns that the Israelites use in constructing their ritual furniture is exceptionally consistent with what we find the Egyptians doing. Hmm. So there does seem to be some direct, at least, reproduction of construction methods. Now, you asked me two questions there. I kind of answered the second first. You'll have to remind me what the first question was again, because I already forgot.
The Ark of the Testimony, and then suddenly, because I don't recall seeing that in the Bible. I just recall the Ark of the Covenant.
That's used essentially from Exodus all the way through to midway through Numbers, roughly Numbers chapter 9. It's called the Ark of the Testimony. Now, the testimony here is the word adut in Hebrew. And adut is a very interesting word. It actually is a Semitic word that actually appears in Egyptian as well. So we find it used in, say, the harem conspiracy of that led to the assassination of Ramses III. What's interesting about this is it carries a connotation of conspiring, not just testimony, but conspiracy. Now, in the particular case, the sort of conspiracy that's happening to is a benevolent one. It's basically like if you go up to a merchant and you want to arrange a contract to have something made. You and the merchant are conspiring to come to an agreement. Okay, so it has that connotation. So you could sort of almost call this the arc of the agreements or the negotiations. The arc of the negotiations. And then once the negotiation is finalized, it's now a covenant. It's a contract. So you have the negotiations and the contract phase. And the arc goes through this name change as the negotiations progress from settling out terms to final agreement.
That's interesting. And another thing about the Ark itself that you talked about that I didn't realize. Now, you said we were talking about how the construction of the Ark, and it's really incredible because in the Bible it lays out much detail on how this was going to be made and the dimensions and everything about it, so that you can reconstruct it pretty easily. But you also talked about the acacia wood and like the very thin gold that would also be covering it, that was consistent with how Egyptians covered their materials in some of these sorts of things. But the acacia,
you find that all sorts of places in Egypt. We find several examples of furniture made this way in the Tomb of King Tut. His Anubis chest is basically wood covered with foil inside and out. His Tut's Gati shrines, the shrines that were used to surround his sarcophagus, are essentially made of wood, covered with gold inside and out, and then inlaid with lapis or whatever lapis substitute they had, because they also used glass for this as well.
That's fascinating. But the acacia itself, now you were talking about the way that the forestry was back at that time was a little different in the Sinai than how it is today. So you said there was you have evidence, or we have evidence apparently, of significant quantities of acacia trees.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things about the acacia is a it's a tree that's endemic to savannas. Okay, so you'll still find, say, acacia trees in African savanna. They're not nice trees to be around. I mean, they got these great big thorns, and they're kind of nasty trees, but they do produce good wood. And given the right environment, they'll actually grow quite large. And during the late Bronze Age, the Sinai still had both acacia and almond trees. So that was part of the savanna ecosystem that was still there at the end of the late Bronze Age. And this is just sort of the last effects of that Neolithic wet phase that's now drying out. There was even a time when Sinai had substantial rainfall. Like there's a great big wadi, and wadi is a seasonal river. It's a seasonal river that stretches from the very interior of the Sinai and goes right to the Mediterranean. It's a massive wadi. So at one point, the Sinai had incredible amounts of precipitation, enough to make a river system that big.
Wow. Yeah, I was listening to a video that was talking about millions of years ago and how the entire Mediterranean filled up from the Atlantic and in just like this huge portion of water coming in. And I mean, it's just interesting to think about the fact that our weather, things change. And so I think just that
even during the early Holocene period, the water levels were much higher, and there was some inland flooding too. But it was just a climatically different period than what we have today. And I see this mistake made often where people look at the Sinai today and think, well, this is what it was like during the time of Moses. It wasn't quite. I mean, it wasn't ever like, it wasn't during the, say during the late Bronze Age. It never really was, say, verdant fields, but it was grassland. And the Midianites used to pasture their sheep there. So this is why we have, say, tribes of Shasu, wandering through the Sinai. And we find these tribes wandering there, as late as the Assyrian period, where the prisms of Ezrahad and Ashurbanipal, record their encounters with tribal groups in the Sinai.
That's interesting.
Well, if there was nothing out there to feed their sheep, what are they doing out there?
That's and that kind of just brings me to another thing. I'm looking at in the books of Moses, the 5 books, the Pentateuch, or they call it the Torah, or that kind of thing. We would expect that if Moses authored this, that if he authored it, we should find evidence, I would think, of some sort of Egyptian, not only context that you've described quite well, but also in the language. And I know you've said this before, but I just wanted to, so our viewers can hear this again. And you didn't say it in this video, but a different video, is just talking about, if you look at the wording in there, do we find evidence of Egyptian loanwords or anything like that?
Absolutely. Yeah. We find a great study was done by Benjamin Noonan on non-Semitic loanwords found in the Old Testament. And he compares all the books of the Old Testament and says, okay, because you can't do this with Semitic words, because Semitic words are just so similar that you can't tell exactly which language they came from. But non-Semitic words, very, very easy to sort of figure out. Okay, it comes from this language, it comes from that language. And we find that, say, in the Pentateuch, it is rich with Egyptian loanwords. But we don't find any, say, Old Persian loanwords, which is what we would expect if it was written in Babylon or in the Persian period.
Yes. That is very good to know.
But we find, for example, in, say, the Book of Kings, the later prophets, we do find lots of Persian words. We find, even some, characteristics of, say, how these words are used that even are indicative of the time frame. Like there's one particular word, Egyptian word, that we find that changes its form over time. And it changes its form at around 1200 BC. And the Bible preserves that old form, not the new one.
Good. Yep. See, sorry, atheists, you guys are losing this one again. So we're just bashing all your theories.
We find Egyptian names. Phineas, Panahesi, the Nubian. Her comes from the Egyptian word Horus, Hor.
That's interesting.
Even Moses comes from a derivation of an Egyptian Emshe name, like Amen Emshe, Mantu Emshe. They just take off the theophoric element, and you're left with Emshe, Moshe.
That's good. That's really good. So so sorry again, atheists. And the atheists also are, like Kipp Davis says, he seems to think that this is there's a lot of scholarly support for the documentary hypothesis. But I've heard you say that it's coming out of favor in some of these Egyptian schools. So I wanted to see if you wanted
it's coming out of favor in Europe. That's where it's really sort of.
Oh, did I say Egyptian school? I meant European. Yeah. Sorry.
In Europe, it's fallen out of favor. It is still, I mean, what's replacing it is more supplementary hypotheses and redactional theories. Okay,
Mhm.
so that's what sort of has replaced it. But the documentary hypothesis itself is no longer considered to be a great hypothesis in European schools. It still has its attractions in Europe, or sorry, in North America. North America seems to be the final stronghold of this.
Mhm.
But I expect in possibly 50, 100 years that, it'll be sort of laughed at like phrenology was.
Well, I like how the stones cry out. And so all of these people in the 1700s and 1800s, especially in these German universities, are proposing that Isaiah and Moses and all of these authors, because they see fulfilled prophecies. They saw Deuteronomy 32 and they saw the Leviticus and how that the exiles and all of the kind of stuff that was fulfilled. And that really gets under their craw because they're atheists and they don't like this idea of fulfilled prophecies. And so they just pretend that the books were written during the time when the prophecies were fulfilled. And so that's where this documentary says there's all these multiple authors and they're just adding in all this information. And
Well,
we don't have any ancient
always
support
loves
for it.
skepticism.
Say it again.
The Academy loves and rewards skepticism.
Mhm.
It also rewards mediocrity. Nobody wants the big advances in the Academy. We all want these sort of little incremental advances because they're easier to digest and they're less controversial and they're lower risk. And the Academy is all about risk mitigation.
Mhm.
So when you've got a theory that's sort of the mainstream, you have this sort of Kuhnian paradigm going on, where the paradigm is going to just get slowly chipped away at until it is no longer tenable at all.
Mhm.
That's what we're seeing is right now that process of the paradigm being slowly chipped away at.
Yeah, and good. And I like what you said in other videos you've talked about with every turn of the shovel. A lot of times, a lot of the information, just like the Dead Sea Scrolls, a lot of the stuff that was coming out in the 1700s and 1800s and their propositions all got bashed with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so I think it's fantastic. We'll probably see something.
It also began even before then, with the text we found at Oxyrhynchus, which changed entirely how we read biblical Greek. It was no longer considered to be a magical, mystical language anymore. Because prior to Oxyrhynchus, we didn't have much evidence for Greek that period, Koine Greek, outside the Bible.
Do you think that the New Testament, I know this is not your field, but I'm just curious to know what you think on this. Do you think the New Testament was originally written in Aramaic, or it was originally written in Greek?
It was written in Greek. The thing with we have there's one church father, Papias, who says that one of the Gospels, I believe it's Matthew, was originally written in Hebrew and then translated into Greek. But I think that New Testament in general was originally written in Greek. Now, we have to kind of understand that, these people weren't stupid in the first century.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everyone sort of in the academic community thinks that people who wrote these books were dumb.
Yeah.
If we look at the context of the New Testament, just restricted to the New Testament, it was a highly literate society.
Mm-hmm.
There were public libraries where you could go and you could take a scroll off the shelf and you could read it. There were educational institutions, like yeshivas, or at least what start off and ultimately led to yeshivas. These were places where you could learn things like philosophy, religion, to be a scribe, to write, to read. Your typical Palestinian, for lack of a better word, would have been conversant in multiple languages.
Mm-hmm.
They would have known Aramaic. They would have known Greek. They would have known Hebrew. They might have even known some Latin, depending upon how educated they were. Like, for example, Josephus was conversant in many languages.
Yeah, and like when above Jesus on the cross, they had the words written in 3 languages.
Yeah.
So
Josephus was conversant in many languages, not just the ones he worked in, but he was conversant in other languages too.
And you are too. Tell the audience how many languages you know.
Oh, no.
This is unbelievable to a person who can barely speak Spanish. That would be me. I used to be better at it, but now
I'm terrible at speaking languages. Terrible at it. I'm not verbally fluent in much of any languages, including English. But
no, you're fine in English.
But I can read a lot of languages. I can read Hebrew, Greek, 4 dialects of Egyptian, Akkadian. I got a little bit of Hittite and Ugaritic. I also know German, French, and Japanese, and I'm picking up a little bit of Slavic languages as well.
Now, that going back to that study that you mentioned before about the different wording or words that are in the Old Testament, I'm just wondering. You mentioned Akkadian. Have you taken a look to see if the book of Isaiah, for example, has little Akkadian plants in there?
Well, that's the problem. Is the Akkadian is a Semitic language. It's a West Semitic language. An Eastern Semitic language, as opposed to Hebrew, which is a West Semitic language. So they share a lot of root vocabulary. The root lexemes are the same across both languages.
So it'd be harder to find.
It's very, very difficult to determine what is an Akkadian influence, say, versus what is just generic Semitic. Now, there is some say it is possible to do some of that work because we do have enough texts from the Akkadian language to be able to sort of check out its sort of historical development. We do know that meanings in languages do change over time, and we can map, for example, the changes in Akkadian with its historical period, like Old Babylonian, Old Assyrian, Neo-Assyrian. We can make those sorts of those comparisons to see when does these words change over time. But trying to discover compare those changes in meaning to what we find in, say, Isaiah, very difficult to do.
Okay. I'm wondering now, going back to this idea of redaction. So this is the idea that these people current scholars like Kipp Davis and Joel Baden and Josh Bowen, they all tend to think that that there were people who were just constantly adding to the Bible through the centuries, not just adding their own books, like Isaiah wrote his book, not just adding that, but adding little portions to other people's books through the centuries, and that somehow this escaped notice with the priests who were, I don't know, but I'm wondering how do we, so Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and maybe somebody else might have written a little bit of it.
Wrote the source documents for the Pentateuch.
Yeah, so because you know that he can't write his own death, so we didn't know that. He can't
write his own death. What it probably did was he probably, as he was wandering through the Sinai, just wrote chapters here, chapters there. And then somebody later on strung them together. Because we'll get, for example, in, say, like the Book of Numbers, Moses wrote these words, or God told Moses, and then you'll get a full chapter. So you see this more at the beginning and endings of chapters. Those are sort of natural breaks in the text. Yeah. So we don't know who actually did the final editing. It might have been Joshua. We don't know. But it does seem that those, or at least the original sources, as in the sort of the chapters, do seem to have a person writing it who is cognizant of both the culture of Egypt and its vocabulary.
Yeah, very good to know. And then so imagine, so he has this.
Wouldn't make sense.
Yeah.
Like, for example, the whole bread bowl being put in the shoulders of their garments. Your typical Semitic bread bowl is this low, flat dish, big, wide, flat dish. That's a bread bowl. Well, you put that on your shoulders, you're just going to squish the dough against your back. It's not going to be good for anybody to eat that dough when you're done. You're picking out pieces of cloth out of it. But the Egyptian bread bowl is very different. Very, very different. It's essentially a long, tall cylinder. Now, we actually have a picture from Medina Habu of a priest who's carrying scrolls on his shoulder. And they're long, tall cylinders too. And you can see it actually perched behind his shoulders in the shawl.
That's interesting.
It's a detail that would only be known to somebody living in Egypt. Because even the Egyptian garrison towns in Canaan, they're using Semitic bowls. They're not cooking their bread Egyptian style.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And going into that same idea. So he writes this book, he writes the Torah, other people maybe, edit it or whatever. Maybe another person, like maybe Joshua, like you said, or Aaron or somebody else. But then suddenly what happens? Like, I know that we have the discussion that comes about later in the Bible where it says to, I think it's either David or Solomon, that I want you to go ahead and read this, go ahead and write it down, copy it, that sort of thing. So you're supposed to be making copies of the Torah. You have to know the law. And so I'm just wondering, have you ever thought about how many copies might have been present of the Torah in, say, Solomon and David's time, and then beyond that? Because people have posited that because of something that's in 2 Kings, that there was just maybe one copy, and it was found by, which one was it? Oh, was it Hosea? Josiah, yeah, found by Josiah years later, and this is just the only copy. And I don't know if that's realistic. I would think they would have tons of copies.
Well, we're not exactly sure how many copies of these things existed. It's just really, really speculation at this point. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the reasons I think there were so many copies is because we do have a lot of variants of the text. What Kipp and Baden will ascribe to, say, evidence of redaction, which is the multiple variants, can just as easily be interpreted as the multiplicity of copies. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, Daniel Wallace says we have 140,000 Greek words in the New Testament and 300,000 text variants. It's not that the New Testament is being redacted. Far from it. But so many copies are made that there are editorial changes because of glossing, or because of mistakes, lots of spelling mistakes, attempts to make sense of the text are introduced into the text. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, it came down to one source text, one text or Varlaga, that all of that came out of. So I don't see any reason why we should go down the road of redaction when it could just as easily be the result of, say, negligence in the copying process. Mm-hmm. And we know, for example, that at Qumran, standards for copying were a lot lower than they are for, say, other text traditions like we find in the Masoretic text or even the Samaritan Pentateuch. Those texts remain stable for a lot longer than what we find amongst the texts at Qumran. It's almost as if that Qumran was basically a text shop. We find these text shops, for example, happening in medieval Europe. I shouldn't say medieval Europe, but early modern Europe, Renaissance Europe. After the fall of Constantinople to Islam, a lot of people were leaving Constantinople carrying these books into Europe. Well, as soon as they arrived in Europe, scribes in Europe set up these entrepreneurs set up these little sort of copy factories where they would make, say, 100 copies of a book that they received and then sell them. So I'm kind of wondering if that's a similar situation to what we have in Qumran, where they're basically copying a whole lot of texts for mass consumption. This is the time of the Roman occupancy. This is the time when there is greater interest in reading. Mm-hmm. And personal devotional copies were definitely part of what we find amongst the Qumran texts.
That's interesting.
So if they're doing this for money, they could be making this stuff hand over fist, not even caring which ones are authoritative and which ones aren't. It's like, oh, we got this great new copy here. Let's make it. Let's make a dozen copies of it and sell it. And then when it comes time to, abandon shop, they just sort of store it all and hopefully hoping to come back later, and they never do.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really, I've never thought about it that way. That's a very interesting hypothesis that I had to say thanks to Sentinel Apologetics, did a super chat. He says, Daddy Falk in the house, Deepak Chopra's favorite scholar.
Sure.
So I used to read Deepak Chopra in my 30s. What'd you say?
Rob's being a bit sassy here.
Rob's definitely being sassy. Hey, I wanted also to ask you about, and you talked a little bit about that in this book. Now, everybody go get this book if you haven't yet. This is what we're discussing today, the Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian context, an illustrated journey. There's lots of illustrations in here. But you were talking about, like, what's a typical day in the life of an ancient Egyptian who's not a king, not the wealthy, high-level one, but just the average one? And how do they live? What's their house look like? Do they have furniture?
Well, it's all going to depend on what strata of Egyptian. Okay, Egypt was a highly stratified society. It had the bottom strata was their farmer. They were on the very, very bottom end. We actually know very, very little about how they lived. Then you had, say, the slave class. Then you had sort of a craftsman class above them. That's as close as you're going to get to a middle class. And then you're going to have soldiers and priests and then scribes, and then you're going to go up to the nobility. Okay, so, and it was possible to move between social classes. Completely possible. It just didn't happen very often. So what you did in a day depended really on which class you were in. Mm-hmm. For example, like for the farming class, they would be assigned a plot of land to farm for that season. They would put up a temporary hut. They'd have their mat, their bowl, and their spoon, and not much more. They'd live off the land until it flooded, and they had to go into high ground. And what they did during their time in high ground, nobody knows. We don't know what say any of the marriage customs were for farmers. We don't know much about farming. Nothing was ever written about the farmers. We know they make up the majority of Egyptians, but we know nothing about how they lived, or practically nothing. We got a few reliefs of farmers on some tombs, like the tomb of Paheri, but we know very little. We actually know more about slaves than we do about farmers.
Like the Israelites.
But from Egyptian sources. Egyptians wrote more about their slaves than they did about the farmers. And some of it is because it comes down to contracts, emancipation papers, that sort of thing. We know that you could be freed as a slave or emancipated, and it's usually through the process of adoption. So for you to be freed as a slave, your owner would adopt you as a child and then give you a writ of emancipation. Now, you do have some interesting things, too, where, say, a woman who owned a slave would adopt a slave to free her and then marry that freed slave.
Oh, that's funny.
You had those situations, too.
What was it? Actually, you mentioned this a little bit also in your conversation with Converse Contender, but and I just want to say, so the furniture was pretty sparse. They didn't have beds necessarily. It wasn't like
all luxury goods.
All luxury, yeah. Wow. So we should appreciate what we have today.
Simplest box was a luxury good. So if you were doing really well if you owned a box. Beds and chairs, same deal. Now, in middle-class communities, craftsman communities like Deir el-Medina, people would trade each other in goods and services. So they lived a little better because they would trade within the community. And it's very, very interesting that they all kept receipts. And this is a funny thing because the receipts that they held were IOUs. They were IOUs, but they were worthless IOUs. So it was more of an IOU to keep track of accounts than it was to actually force payment.
That's interesting.
So it'd be like, well, you've already asked me like for 10 pieces of furniture, according to my records. You're not getting another until I get something back. So that's the way the economy worked at Deir el-Medina. And everything was priced. Everything was assigned a value according to the bronze debit. So it was an entirely barter economy. But it was a barter economy pegged to a unit currency.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's not, and so the other thing is I have noted one of my questions I wanted to ask you is what was the ancient equivalent of a Ferrari?
A bed.
A bed.
A bed. That was your ancient equivalent of a Ferrari. But we find this too in say, the Bible, where it talks about the northern kingdom of Israel, and their elite sleeping on couches and beds of ivory. Okay.
Yeah.
And like a Ferrari, you could trick it out. You could trick it out with gold foil and ivory inlays, and it was, exotic woods. These were the par excellence goods of consumptuous consumption.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, let me ask you this also. So you were talking a little bit about, also you mentioned the divorce. It was easy to get a divorce. And I also heard you in another video talking a bit about the bars, like the bar situation. These people would go and they'd get drunk in the bar, drinking Egyptian beer. And then they would hook up with hookers in the bar. It's like, what?
Yes. The way it worked, taverns worked, was that you wouldn't do Egyptian beer. You do wine. If you wanted to get smashed in the ancient Near East, you drank wine, not beer. Beer was more for water purification. But wine was what you drank to get smashed on. And you go to a tavern, you pay some money, you'd get a pot of stew or a bowl of stew and all the wine you could drink. And then you'd get a hooker to keep you warm for the night.
Jeez.
This was true of both, say, Egyptian. Well, true of both Egyptian taverns and say Israelite taverns. So this was true even in Israelite society.
Yeah, that's the other thing. It kind of speaks to the Israelite society. How you said something like the Israelites who were the slaves really weren't terribly familiar with a lot of their religious history.
Yeah. It depended upon, a lot of them were not well versed in their own religious history, especially if they weren't taught. So you do have guys like Jephthah that just were, he was the son of a harlot. He was the son of a harlot, and he was thrown out of his home, and had to make do with what little he knew. Now, one other interesting little distinction, say, between, say, Egyptian taverns and, say, Israelite taverns was that their wine was also sometimes spiked. They would use the juice of the lotus as a narcotic.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah.
Geez.
And this was very, very common. You see lots of reliefs of this where, they're harvesting lotus flowers and squeezing the juice out and then pouring the juice into wine. They'd also say steep wine in just the lotus flowers, and then they would use this straw with a filter on the end to drink the wine. And it would give them a narcotic, hallucinations and a high.
Wow. That's a little crazy. They were living crazy. Who knew that was? I didn't even know that the presence of drugs like that back then we would have.
They had lots of drugs back then. I mean, it wasn't just the lotus. They also imported opium from Cyprus.
Really?
Mm-hmm. We find these little juglets that are shaped like the buds of opium pods that would contain either honey or wine that was infused with opium. Now, sometimes some of that was just used as a pain reliever, but some of it invariably would have been recreational too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, like Ben Franklin said, beer is living proof that God loves us, wants us to be happy. So that's the other thing that you mentioned that I was kind of surprised about. I just assumed that if you're really wealthy, you're always eating really well and you're drinking really well and just your life is really good. But you mentioned some stuff about starvation, that there's this constant concern about starvation.
Oh yeah, the Egyptians were absolutely terrified about starving. Absolutely terrified. It's what really scared them more than anything. Your typical Egyptian would live within 50 calories of starvation. That was your typical Egyptian, and that actually was through the entire strata of society, going right up to the crown prince. So even the crown prince did not eat exceptionally well. And we find that in, say, the mummies, that there was at least 30% of mummies, which represents your upper class. You had to be in the upper class to be mummified. Mm-hmm. Okay, poor people weren't mummified; they were just thrown into a hole in the ground. Your mummies were they were your upper class, and about 30% of the mummies that are examined show signs of chronic starvation. I think one of the things we do see this sort of that the food was not, say, hogged by the upper class. They sort of shared in the portions that the peasants did. So if the peasants starved, the upper class did too. And one of the things was because everyone was so afraid of starvation that it became a horrible, horrible crime to commit gluttony. This is why the Bible talks so much about gluttony. Mm-hmm. It's not because there was an abundance of food and people are getting fat. It's not because of the outward signs of this. It's because if you ate more than your share, somebody else died of starvation. It was a kind of murder.
That is. It's interesting.
It's a kind of murder.
Huh.
This is why it's such a serious crime in the Bible. Because
Makes
you're
sense.
eating more than your allotment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, the king, once he became king, had access to as much as he wanted to eat because it was more important that he stay alive for the stability of the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting too. So if you're let me ask you this: if you have questions in the chat, definitely go ahead and you can tag me in there, and I'll ask Dr. Falk your questions. He's very knowledgeable, of course, because he's an Egyptologist, so he knows a lot about Egypt and a lot about the ancient culture that fascinates us. And so I'm just wondering, I'm kind of thinking one of the things I've never really understood is how is it that the Egyptians had these pyramids, and I believe there's some kind of similar pyramids by the Mayans. And have you ever thought about what the theories are, or you looked at the theories behind why would there be similar periods coming in these ancient periods from all the way around the world? You think the Egyptians traveled over to the Mayans, or the Mayans traveled? I mean, what do people posit about that, or is it just a blind coincidence?
It's called geometry. The fact is that a pyramid is just the most stable way to stack stones. It's just the most stable way to do it. So, of course, that is going to be a physical factor that causes repetition without ontology. You know, the old saying, homology does not imply ontology. Just because we have, a similar structure in another part of the world doesn't mean that they're in any way connected. And they're not in any way connected. There was no trade between Egypt and, say, the Americas.
Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't think so.
Now, we find that Egyptian trade is much more expansive than we thought it was. But it is sort of limited to the old world. We do find, say, scarabs going as far as Spain. And we do, there is some evidence that silk during, say, makes it to Egypt during Dynasty 20. And that's coming from, China or somewhere nearby there. So there does seem there's cloves found in the tomb of King Tut. Those are from India. So there does seem to be a lot of trade going on. The lapis is from Afghanistan. So there's a lot of trade in there. There's trade from Africa into Egypt as well. Ivory's coming in to Abydos from Africa. We do find during the trade expedition of Queen Hatshepsut, she's going to Ethiopia, not her personally, but her trade expedition is going to Ethiopia, and they're coming back with copper ore and gold rings and myrrh trees and incense and rare exotic animals.
Yeah, interesting. One of the persons in the chat here has asked a question about Ron Wyatt, and I know that you've made a popcorn video against Ron Wyatt, and so he was talking about the mercy seat and DNA, and I think Ron Wyatt's put something about that out, and so I wanted to see if you've thought about that or heard that particular.
Yeah, I've heard this. Okay. Ron Wyatt is a con man. He's a fraudster. Nothing he says is true, which is unfortunate because otherwise he would have discovered everything and we could just close shop and go home. But he claimed to have dug underneath the Temple Mount where he found the Ark of the Covenant, collected a blood sample, took it to a lab, had it analyzed, and it had 23 X chromosomes and 1 Y chromosome or something like that. Something very, very strange like that. Oh, there's some problems with this. There's some real problems with this. The first problem is that the Israel Antiquities Authority have completely denied that Ron Wyatt was ever digging in Israel. You need a license to dig. It's a crime to dig without a license.
And especially under the Temple Mount.
Especially under the Temple Mount. This would make Ron Wyatt a criminal. Okay? The second thing is that there is no evidence that the Ark of the Covenant was ever under the Temple Mount. Now, there's a story in the Talmud that says it is, but there's also another story in the Talmud that says that it was melted by Nebuchadnezzar. So, the Talmud's contradictory here. The other thing is that the blood sample that he claims that there's no actual published lab report for. So there's no evidence that any sample at all existed, let alone sent to a lab. Mm-hmm. But it makes no sense. Because one of the things we understand about, say, human genetics and human beings is that we have, as a human male, you have 1 X and 1 Y chromosome. Those are the sex chromosomes. The rest of your genetic complement are other chromosomes. And we have, 48 chromosomes. Jesus Christ was fully God and fully man. If he had 23 X chromosomes and 1 Y chromosomes, he's not fully man. He's something else.
Yeah, why would he even make that up? It's strange.
It's bizarre. But people bought it hook, line, and sinker.
So I also have Keith Colvin saying he wants to know if there's any evidence of cannabis use, marijuana, by the Egyptians.
This came out in a recent article. I think it's the Jerusalem Post. Now, it's highly unlikely. Cannabis as a plant originates in Southeast Asia. And it's a very, very unlike. It's not a plant that's endemic to the Middle East. It's not endemic to it. It was imported into the Middle East. However, we do get these situations from time to time where, how do I say this nicely? You get some guy who's token on the job and leaves a little ash behind. Like, for example, sometimes we'll find a cocaine residue on mummies.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Jeez.
Well, cocaine is a North American or South American plant. It's a coca plant. It's a Central American plant. So, but cocaine use was really, really in vogue in the 19th century in England. That was sort of the drug of choice amongst the elite. And our British archaeologists were amongst the elite. So they were often toking up when when doing their excavations.
Jeez.
You also get these sort of sloppy practices too. Like there was I won't. This happened in the 20th century, so this is not 19th century. But there was a guy who, an archaeologist, who would read stele, which is a stone inscription, by pouring tea on it to make it easier to read.
Oh, geez.
So imagine what kind of residue that's going to leave.
Yeah, it's going to ruin it. It's crazy. So
there's even a archaeological paleontological report where a triceratop was identified, and a DNA sample was taken and found to be 100% identical with a turkey. Well, if you've got 100% DNA match with a turkey, you don't have a triceratop, you have turkey. Okay? Somebody ate a turkey sandwich and left it behind.
That's crazy. People are crazy. So I also want you to, just another thing that I have here from Dr. Joel Baden, the name of his, or Baden, the name of the video here is Canaanites Were Israelites. Do you know anything about the theory that Canaanites were really Israelites, or?
Yeah, this is the endemic population. Essentially, he supports the theory that Israelites essentially were native to Canaan, and essentially sort of rose up within Canaan, sometimes called the peaceful infiltration, or the endemic population. So he thinks that just Canaanites, maybe one of them were a tribe called Levi that were native to Canaan, and then convinced everybody to go along with the Levitical, story. Well, I've got some clear issues with that. The provenance of the texts, its vocabulary is just sort of the tip of the iceberg to all of that. It's very, very difficult for me to accept that, when you look at, say, national origin stories, okay, you do get two kinds of national origin stories. And there's more than that, obviously, but they do sort of roughly fall into two categories. You got the highly, highly mythological ones, the ones that are so far back in antiquity that they take on, say, mythological significance. Mm-hmm. Like the origin stories of, say, the Egyptians. They were there so long, going back even before the unification of the country, that they ascribe their origin to mythological terms. You see this amongst, say, the origin stories of China, where the sun god, the goddess, creates the first emperor, and he establishes China. Okay? But then you have stories that are more concrete and more lowly. These tend to be much more historically accurate, like the origin story for the United States. Mm-hmm. They're a British colony. They rose up. They had a revolution and drove the limeys out. Okay? That's a very, very detailed origin story that's historically coherent. So when we look at, say, the origin story of the Israelites, it's highly detailed. Highly detailed. I mean, incredibly detailed. Crazy. I mean, for an national origin story, it's got crazy detail. Mm-hmm. It's specific. It's lowly origins. Nobody wants to claim that your ancestors were slaves. Nobody wants to claim that. That's not something that you exalt yourself. You mean most even say the origin stories of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. They're kings.
And the Romans.
Kings and the Romans. Yes. Oh yeah, Romulus and Remus.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. One kills the other and becomes king of Rome. Now they're high birth, stories, or stories of small man makes big. But nobody does an origin story of slaves who get free and then become rebellious and end up dying in the wilderness because they can't hold up their end of the bargain.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of origin story is that?
Yeah, and even for Moses to have died off, here was the guy who led them.
Yeah,
even he was supposed to get to Canaan.
He doesn't make it. So it's a really unusual origin story if you want to claim that it's all made up.
I like that looking at it that way.
Well, even sort of the whole Moses narrative. We look at, say, Moses, and it's sort of one of the really odd things that we find is it really fits into the pattern of, say, late Bronze protest movements. We do find these sort of things in Egyptian documents, like at the strikes that happened at the end of Dynasty 20, the labor strikes, that occurred at Deir el-Medina, where they're not getting their food, and they decide to go on strike, and the local Magi, intervenes and says, hey, this is a military dictatorship. You don't want Pharaoh coming in and crushing skulls. So take your tools, lock them up in your home so no one accuses you of stealing. Take your half day off to strike, and so Pharaoh doesn't think you're robbing him of time. Don't go down to the river so Pharaoh thinks you're running away. And I'll negotiate on behalf of you with the mayor of Thebes. I, as a Magi, have standing with both the mayor of Thebes and you workers. So you got this outsider who has standing in both communities, who's doing the negotiation. And one of the interesting little bits about this is the Magi says to the mayor of Thebes, hey, if you don't agree to the terms, I'll go to the vizier. I'll go to the next rank up. And I'll negotiate with him. And he'll do it. Because he knows us and he's one of us. He comes from our neck of the woods. And the mayor of Thebes gives in. Well, you look at, say, the Moses narrative, here's this guy who is raised in an upper class house. Okay. He's raised in the mansion of the governor of Avaris, of Lower Egypt. And, he's retroactively a son of the daughter of a king. And so he's got standing. He's got standing to appear before Pharaoh. Being the son of a daughter of a king buys him nothing except the right to an audience. It's the only thing it buys him. But now he's got that standing. He's an Israelite by blood, so he's got standing with his community. He goes to Pharaoh, hey, you know what? Let my people go. And if you don't, I'll appeal to the boss upstairs. Which, being king, there's only one place to go. To God. So there's a very strong similarity between the Moses figure and the leaders of protest movements that we find in the New Kingdom.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's all
Parallels.
Good stuff. So Dr. Falk, we've gone an hour and 20 minutes, and I'm just wondering if maybe the next few minutes, and I haven't seen any other questions coming in, although I have seen a lively conversation going back and forth, so I want to say thanks to that. Can you let us know is there anything else that we should have covered? Like, I know I didn't ask you, and I probably should have asked you now that I'm thinking about it, the Ark of the Covenant and where you think it is today? Is it buried in a hillside?
No, I think it was melted by Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah.
Basically, what the Babylonians did was when they conquered a place, a temple, and they took all the goodies. They usually broke the big pieces down, melted that for metal to pay their soldiers. Mm-hmm. So the big pieces were all destroyed. So
and all that gold.
All that gold, yeah. So I'm pretty much guessing that it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. Now the one other thing we should cover is, say, the iconography of the Ark itself, that it's highly datable. The Ark of the Covenant in its iconography is extremely datable, because what we find is that those cherubim that we find on there is something that was only used in a certain period of time in Egypt. And it was essentially used from between the reign of Amenhotep III in Dynasty 18 to the end of Dynasty 20. After that, it's no longer used.
And which dynasty was Ramses II again?
Dynasty 19.
Okay.
So it falls right between. Falls right between the end of Dynasty 18 and the end of Dynasty 20.
That is.
So it's very, very similar. We find this entire sort of iconography matches very, very well with that time period.
Yeah, that's good.
Even the Ark of the Covenant itself is evidence that implies it's dating.
Yeah. Jamie Russell is kind of adding into that last question that I asked you about the Ark of the Covenant and saying, what about Revelation? It is seen in heaven. You think God could magically resurrect it?
Well, this was a theory that was purported by Henry Morris, the creationist. You know, he thought that the Ark of the Covenant was magically sort of transported from Earth and brought up into the celestial temple. And I just don't see there's any need for that, honestly. The fact is that the Ark of the Covenant is an analogical device. It's a device that is meant to convey through theology through its construction, through its iconography, through its construction. You have the holy presence of the Lord between the wings of the cherubim, sitting over the law. He is seated over the law. So there's a cosmographic component to this. The law on the earth, but the Lord in the heavens. So what we have, for example, is in the heavens, what we have is an analogical language here being shown that, you know, the covenant is still there in its temple practice, but it's covered by the blood of the Lamb. So it's not in a sense, it's a more real ark. Mm-hmm. It's a more real ark than the physical ark, but it is not the same ark. It's an ark of religious ideas expressed through analogical language, connoting a greater reality.
Well, that makes sense to me. Just kind of like Jesus' body, the appearance that he will have in heaven is different than the appearance he had exactly on earth, and so it makes sense. So I've got maybe just one more question here. This is from Susan Slam RN. She says, I have run into several Muslims who think Noah's Ark has been found and that they have a nail from the Ark of Noah. Have you heard of that, or what do you think of something like that?
This is another yarn spun by Ron Wyatt.
Oh, really? Right. Wreaking havoc.
He wreaked all sorts of havoc. You know, he claimed to find the Ark of the Covenant, the blood of Jesus, the skull of Adam, the home of Noah, Noah's Ark, Noah's tomb, pillars of Solomon, the real Mount Sinai. Oh my gosh, the guy was a menace.
And I fell for it. I have to admit, I fell for some of his stuff.
I fell for it too. You know, before I went to graduate school, I fell for it. Sure.
Yeah,
It was a
I thought,
great
well, that's
story.
really cool.
Wow, Jesus Christ was crucified on on Golgotha, and the blood dripped down the
Yes,
crack
that's what I
of
was going to say.
Golgotha, first touching the skull of Adam, and then dripping onto the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant,
Yes.
all without seeping into the soil.
Yes. I mean, it sounded good. When I first heard it, I was like, oh, that's, and the other one was David Roll. I was listening to his stuff, and that made sense to me.
Too.
And then I came over to your channel and say, I saw your refutation of inspiring philosophy. That was where I first heard you. So
Yeah, basically the quote Noah's Ark Park in Turkey, in the Ararat Mountains, is essentially a natural geological formation. It's an entirely natural geological formation, and this has been confirmed many times. So it's not petrified wood; it's basically hokum.
So one of the things, actually, if you guys haven't had a chance, definitely go over and subscribe to Dr. Falk's channel. You're going to want to pick up this book, The Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian Context. And you're also going to want to listen to some of his popcorn videos because they are very entertaining. And he has something that he does that keeps the suspense going because we don't get to know who he's going to review before he reviews it. So you have to wonder, and lots of people, including me, have sent him videos saying, please review this. You have to review this. And so, but he's getting bombarded with that stuff.
Secrets.
But see, it was funny because Dr. Kipp Davis did this video and I was waiting, and you put a little hint on there. I forgot what the hint was, that you were definitely going to respond. And then all of a sudden you came back and responded. And so that was very good response. I know you got a lot of compliments in the comments section on that. So very, very thorough.
It was a very, very lively comment section. Yeah, very lively. Yeah. We had over like 200 comments in there, so it was very lively.
Oh, that's good. So thank you, Taking Back Eden. It says, can someone call themselves a heart surgeon if they don't know how to, the steps to perform a bypass, or a Christian if they don't know the 10 commandments? I don't know. What do you think about that? That's a generous super chat. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Christianity is not based upon what you know. It's not based upon what you know. It's who you know. We're not Gnostics. We're not Gnostics. Christianity is not based upon your knowledge, even of the Bible. However, can you live a full discipled life without knowing the Bible?
Yeah.
It comes down to praxis, right practice. We have orthodoxy and we have orthopraxis. Right doctrine and right living. We are not saved by what we know, but we are certainly discipled by it.
Good answer.
We cannot live out the orthopraxis without knowing the 10 commandments. We cannot live the orthopraxis without knowing the 2 commandments.
Yeah, love the Lord above all else and love your neighbors as yourself. Yep. I also want to do a little shout out here. Your wife has been making some very educated comments in here addressing a lot of the topics that we've covered. So please, also, if you guys just go take a look at Kiera Falk, she's a smart woman who's got a lot of good comments here also. So once the comments show, I know that doesn't show right after the video is over, but once the comments show up again, you guys can make sure you go back and check those out. So Dr. Falk, where can we find you next? Besides on your channel, are you going on anyone else's channel coming up soon?
Yes. Wednesday, I'll be on Praise I Am's channel, where he wants me to discuss the ancient Hebrew cosmology and how it relates to, I think, the flat Earth doctrines.
Oh, John, who's in here, he's Taking Back Eden. He is a flat Earth advocate. And so he will probably want to go over there and take a look at that. So thank you. And then, so I know I think you might even come in with Converse Contender somewhat again. Are you going back on his channel?
I don't have anything planned with Converse Contender at the moment.
Okay.
But I do have, I usually do one interview a week. At least I try to schedule one a week. I do have a kind of a queue So, if people do want to invite me on their channel, I'm always open. I don't discriminate based upon, say, size of channel. I'll go on small channels. I'll go on big channels. For me, this is an act of service.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate it.
So
yeah, this is the second time you've been on my channel, and I very much appreciate it.
Well, you asked and you were available. I mean, the thing is, they have to be willing to basically interview me on short notice.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of a lot of sticking point for a lot of people. People want to plan out 8 weeks in advance, and I'm just not able to do that. So
yeah, that's the hard thing. It's a little hard for some.
Hard.
But I knew I was open this weekend, and so I just sent you I had finished this book, and I wanted to be sure to talk about it because I do think it's a great book. You guys have to go out and buy it. And so I just also want to say thank you so much for coming in here and being so generous with your time, because I am a smaller channel. And last time you came on my channel, my viewership, my subscribers, I think I got like 40 or 50 subscribers right after you came on my channel. Yeah. So I was really excited.
It's wonderful.
Yes, exactly. If anyone's in the chat and you haven't subscribed to Dr. Falk's channel, please do. It's Ancient Egypt and the Bible. So get over there. I think I've got a link in the description, but if I don't, I will put it in there. So thank you. Final parting shots, Dr. Falk?
It's been lovely to be here. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you. I have too. I learned a lot, so I'm going to have to listen to it again and take notes, because I didn't take notes this time because I was busy listening. So I'm going to take some notes so I can go fight with those atheists who are trying to posit all kinds of crazy notions. So you guys, so thank you. Whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Thank you so much. Let's have a great day.